everything and not knowing how to maneuver. It wasn't him. It wasn't my mom. It was just a combination of this, that, this going on.
They called him MLB's monster, and every single legend who faced Ken Griffey Jr. in his prime will tell you that title is not an exaggeration. It is barely enough, because what Griffey did to the best players of the 1990s was not just dominate them, he demoralized them. He broke their spirits. He made the game feel rigged. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Now here is the question that should keep you up at night. If 9 of the greatest names the sport has ever produced, from Mariano Rivera to Barry Bonds, all say the same thing about one man, what does that tell you about that man? It tells you he was not just a great player. It tells you he was something else entirely, something the game had never quite seen before and has not fully seen since. Today, we are going inside the testimonies of those 9 legends. We are going to feel what they felt. We are going to understand why facing Junior was not just hard, it was hopeless. If this video gives you that same feeling of awe and helplessness that Griffey gave his opponents, go ahead and give this video some hype. Hit that hype button right now because this story deserves it. Let us start with the man who defined the terror of the decade from the mound. Let us start with the one who closed games for the most dominant dynasty of the era. Let us start at the end of the lineup and work our way to the beginning of the nightmare. Number 9, Chipper Jones. Chipper Jones was not a soft player. He was the engine of the Atlanta Braves offense for over a decade. He knew what it meant to compete at the highest level. And when Chipper Jones tells you that a player could deflate an entire dugout, you should listen carefully, because that is exactly what he said about Ken Griffey Jr. and his play in center field. Think about what it means to deflate a dugout, not just to make one player feel bad, not just to get one out, but to take the air out of the lungs of an entire team in a single moment. Chipper described Griffey as a player who broke your spirit on defense, and that is a phrase that does not get used lightly in professional baseball. You see, in the late innings of a close game, when your team finally gets hold of a pitch and sends a deep drive to center field, you feel something. Every player in that dugout rises. Every coach leans forward. For 1 second, you believe you have done something right. You believe the work paid off. And then Griffey appeared. He was already moving before the ball was halfway to the wall. He ran with a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his power. And then, with a horizontal dive or a wall-climbing leap, he took it. Just like that. Gone. The run that was going to change the game was gone. The momentum you had worked 3 innings to build was gone. And what replaced it was a silence in that dugout that was worse than any argument or any mistake. It was the silence of a team that realized, quietly and all at once, that they might not be able to win this game no matter what they did. Chipper said the fear was not just that Griffey would take your hit. The fear was that your success would be erased. Imagine doing everything right, executing a perfect swing on a tough pitch, making solid contact, sending the ball on the right line, and still losing, because the man in center field simply was not going to let you have it. That is not just a baseball problem. That is a psychological problem, and it made opposing hitters press. It made them try to hit the ball where Griffey was not. And when a hitter starts thinking like that, they stop hitting. They start making mistakes. They hand the pitcher easy outs. Griffey's glove was not just a defensive weapon, it was a trap. For 10 straight years in the 1990s, Griffey won the Gold Glove in center field. 10 years, not 9, not 8, 10 consecutive years of being officially recognized as the best defensive center fielder in baseball. That means for an entire decade, every team in baseball had to accept that the most dangerous part of their offensive game plan had a wall in front of it. And that wall was wearing number 24 and smiling. The weight of that streak is hard to communicate to someone who has never had to plan around it. Because when you are building a lineup and thinking about how to score runs and what kind of contact you need to make progress against an elite pitcher, you always think about center field as a viable destination. The gaps, the deep balls, the line drives that have enough carry to get through. In a normal game against a normal center fielder, some of those balls fall in. Some of those balls change innings. Some of them turn into the runs that win games. But in a game with Griffey out there, none of that felt safe. None of it felt like a real plan. And having your plan taken away before the game even starts is its own kind of demoralization. It is the Chipper Jones effect, the deflation that begins the moment you see the lineup card and see number 24 in center. Number 8, Mike Piazza. If Chipper Jones saw Griffey from the dugout, Mike Piazza saw him from the closest possible view. As a catcher, Piazza crouched behind home plate and watched every swing from inches away. He heard things that the average fan never hears. He felt the shift in the game that happened when certain hitters stepped in. And he said that when Ken Griffey Jr. stepped into the batter's box, something changed that he had never felt with any other hitter. He said Griffey changed the gravity of the stadium. That is not a metaphor you throw around casually. Gravity, the force that pulls everything toward a center. And Piazza was saying that when Griffey arrived in the box, the entire stadium bent toward him. Every eye, every breath, every hope and every fear in the building shifted and reorganized around Junior. Fans leaned forward, pitchers tensed, coaches gripped their clipboards a little tighter. The game reorganized itself around the fact that this man was now holding a bat. But the most specific thing Piazza described was the sound. He said the sound of the ball coming off Griffey's bat was different from anyone else in the league. Not just louder, different in quality. He called it sharper and more explosive. He used the word whoosh. And for a catcher who had heard thousands of swings from the best hitters in the world, the fact that one player's contact sound stood apart is remarkable. It means that something at the physics level was different. The bat speed, the contact quality, the rotation through the zone, all of it combined to produce a sound that told you, before the ball even landed, that something serious had just happened. And Piazza said that sound did something to the pitcher. Even a ball hit into the gap, which is technically a defensive success because it is not a home run, sounded different when Griffey hit it. It sounded better, more violent, more intentional. And that sound served as a constant reminder to the battery that they were in danger, that the at-bat was never truly safe, that even their good pitches were being treated as opportunities by the man in the box. Piazza also noted something that connects directly to what Chipper Jones described. He said that with Griffey in the lineup, the 27 outs that a pitcher needed to complete a game felt much further away. Think about that mathematically. The game did not change. There were still 27 outs, but the psychological distance to get there stretched and warped because one hitter made each out feel harder, more fragile, more expensive. That is the power of a player who changes the gravity of a stadium. He does not just beat you, he makes the entire structure of the game feel harder to finish. Number 7, Barry Bonds. Before the numbers that defined his later years, Barry Bonds was part of the most compelling debate in baseball. Who was the best player in the world? And for a long stretch of the 1990s, that debate had exactly two names, Barry Bonds and Ken Griffey Jr. They were peers. They were rivals in the truest sense. And what Bonds said about Griffey carries a weight that no outside observer could replicate, because this was one monster recognizing another. Bonds called Griffey a natural, and coming from a man who was himself one of the most gifted athletes the sport has ever produced, that word carries a specific meaning. Bonds worked. He was known for his analytical approach in the batting cage. He studied pitchers. He refined mechanics. He put in hours that most players never considered. And he looked at Griffey and saw something different. He saw a player whose swing looked as though it were gifted by the gods. That phrase is important because it points to something that pitchers across the league discovered the hard way. Griffey did not have weaknesses that practice could create. He did not have a hole that film study could exploit. Bonds made the point directly. Most great hitters, no matter how gifted, carry a specific pitch or a specific location where they are vulnerable. A pitch off the back foot, a fastball up and in, a breaking ball in the dirt. Some pattern that a pitcher can find through film and repeat in a game. And if you can find that hole, you have a plan. Against Griffey, there was no consistent hole. His swing was so fluid and technically sound that pitchers could not settle on a reliable approach over a full series. They might get him once on an inside fastball, but the next time, he was ready for it. They might get him on a breaking ball away, but then he would drive the next one into the gap. The lack of a hole made him impossible to plan for. It meant that every plate appearance was a fresh problem with no established solution. And when you add that to Bonds noting that Griffey could do so many things to beat you, not just hit home runs, but hit for average and run and throw and field, you start to understand why Bonds viewed him as his only true peer. The fear that Griffey created through Bonds' eyes was the fear of the complete player. A player with no real weakness. A player you could not scheme around. A player who simply showed up and was better than the plan you made. Number 6, Derek Jeter. Derek Jeter came into the major leagues with a specific picture of what a superstar should look like. And he has said clearly that Ken Griffey Jr. was the blueprint. Not one of the blueprints, the blueprint. The model against which all aspirations were measured. And Jeter's view of Griffey's intimidation focuses on something different from power and swing mechanics. He focuses on the cool factor. The cool factor is real and it is underrated. It is the idea that some athletes carry a style and a confidence that functions as its own competitive weapon. Before a pitch is thrown, before a swing happens, before any statistic is produced, the cool factor is already operating, putting opponents on their heels, making them aware that they are in the presence of something different. And Griffey had it in a way that no other player of the era could match. Jeter noted that Griffey made the impossible look routine. The backward cap in batting practice. The swing that looked like it required no effort. The catches in center field that came off like he had done them 1,000 times in his driveway. All of it communicated the same thing to every opponent who saw it. This man is so far above this competition that he can afford to be stylish while doing it. He has the luxury of cool because the fundamentals are already so far beyond what anyone else is bringing. And that communication, which happened silently and constantly, was its own form of pressure. Because when you see a player who looks that comfortable, that natural, that effortlessly dominant, something shifts in your mind as an opponent. You start watching him more than you should. You start thinking about him more than you should. You deviate from your own game plan. You stop focusing on your mechanics and your approach and your responsibilities, and you start focusing on the spectacle of Junior. And the moment you do that, you have already given him an advantage he did not even have to earn. Jeter also pointed out something that amplified all of this. Griffey did it without the whisper of any enhancement allegations. In a decade when suspicion clouded many of the great performances, Griffey stood as a pure and natural talent. And that purity made the cool factor even more potent. Because it meant there was no asterisk to comfort his opponents with. No way to tell yourself it was something other than him. It was just him, just Junior. Just the blueprint operating exactly as built. And that realness, that purity, followed Griffey everywhere. It followed him into the stadiums, where fans who rooted against him still cheered when he came to the plate. It followed him into the highlight reels, where his catches and his swings became the standard that every other player's highlights were compared to. It followed him into the locker rooms of the teams that faced him, where players would quietly admit, when the cameras were gone, that watching Junior play was something special, even when he was hurting you. That kind of respect does not come from numbers alone. It comes from something that lives in the way a player moves, the way they carry themselves, the way they make the game look like it was built specifically for them. Griffey had all of that. Number 5, Frank Thomas. Frank Thomas was called the Big Hurt for a reason. He was one of the most physically imposing and offensively dominant first basemen in the history of the American League. His numbers in the early and mid-1990s were staggering. His approach at the plate was meticulous. And when a player of that caliber tells you that another player was the scary one, you pay attention. Thomas described Griffey as the ultimate five-tool threat. And the word ultimate is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because every scout in baseball uses the five-tool framework: speed, power, hitting ability, fielding, and arm strength. There are players who earn that label every year. But Thomas was saying that in Griffey's case, it was not a scout's compliment. It was a tactical reality that made every inning of every game a potential crisis. Thomas pointed to a specific sequence that Griffey made routine, and calling it routine is the most chilling part. Griffey would go to the wall in center field and take a home run away from an opponent. A ball that was hit well, a ball that had enough to get out, a ball that the hitter probably watched for half a second with a raised heart rate. Gone, caught at the wall, 2 runs erased. And then Griffey would come up in the very next half inning and hit a home run himself. The same man who just took something from you would turn around and take something else. He would erase your production and then produce his own. Thomas made the arithmetic of that sequence clear. You were never safe when your team was hitting, because Griffey might erase what you accomplished. And you were never safe when your team was pitching, because Griffey might produce something you could not stop. There was no half of the game where you could exhale. There was no phase of play where the threat went away. Thomas noted that while other power hitters of the era were one-dimensional, using their physical gifts purely for offense, Griffey used every part of his athleticism against you. The whole game, all 9 innings, no rest. Thomas called him the gold standard. And that phrase lands differently when it comes from a player who was himself one of the best offensive forces of the generation. The gold standard means the reference point, the level against which everything else is measured. And Thomas was saying Griffey set that level so high that the entire decade organized itself around the question of who came closest to Junior. And the cruelest part of the five-tool reality that Thomas described is that none of those tools ever took a day off. Some players carry a weapon that is occasionally neutralized. Some sluggers have days when their swing is not right. Some elite defenders have stretches when their range is a little short. Griffey did not seem to have those days. He showed up and all 5 tools were ready. And for the team that had to pitch to him and field against him and run the bases while he was tracking balls in center, there was no day circled on the calendar where you could expect relief. Every game with Griffey in the lineup was a full deployment of everything he had. That is what Thomas was really saying when he used the word ultimate. Not just the best. Not just impressive, but the fullest version of the 5-tool player that the sport has ever seen walking across a diamond. Number 4, Greg Maddux. Greg Maddux was called the Professor. He won 4 straight Cy Young Awards. He built his entire career on the idea that if you could move the ball and change speeds, every hitter was helpless. It was not just a theory. For the vast majority of hitters across his career, it was true. He made elite contact hitters look silly. He made powerful sluggers chase pitches a foot off the plate. He turned the strike zone into a chessboard where he always seemed to be 3 moves ahead. And then there was Griffey. Maddux viewed facing Griffey like a chess match he could not win through strategy alone. That is a remarkable admission from the most strategic pitcher of his era. Because Maddux always had a plan. He always had adjustments. He always had a next move. But Griffey defied the axiom that Maddux had built his career on. The idea that movement and deception could neutralize any hitter. Griffey was the exception. What made Griffey immune to Maddux's approach was a combination of 2 things that should not exist in the same player: elite mid-flight adjustment and technically flawless mechanics. In professional baseball, once a hitter commits to a swing path, they are locked in. The body has made a decision and the body follows through. There is no changing the mind halfway. Except Griffey could adjust mid-flight. He could barrel up a pitch that he had initially been fooled by. He could recognize the deception, recalculate, and still make solid, explosive contact. Maddux, whose entire game was built on deception, found a hitter whose body could process and respond to deception in real time. And the mental side made it worse. Maddux relied on frustration. He relied on hitters breaking their mechanics under pressure or chasing pitches when they were desperate. He needed some crack in the mental armor to get through to elite hitters. Griffey did not give him one, because Griffey prepared obsessively. He used visualization. He told himself he hit the ball solid hundreds of times before he went to sleep. He saw himself succeeding from the perspective of the fans, the manager, the opponent. He entered every at-bat with a mind that had already run the success scenario so many times that failure felt like the anomaly. Maddux found that Griffey was mentally and physically unbreakable in the box. And for a pitcher whose weapon was the mental game, that was a nightmare with no solution. Maddux once said that even when he threw what he considered a perfect pitch, one that landed on the corner with late movement, Griffey would still find a way to make solid, explosive contact. A perfect pitch. The kind of pitch that should end the conversation. And Griffey hit it anyway. Number 3, Pedro Martinez. If Maddux was the chess player who ran out of moves, Pedro Martinez was the surgeon who ran out of precision. Pedro in his prime was arguably the most dominant pitcher the sport has ever seen at a peak level. His combination of velocity, movement, and control was so far beyond the average that most hitters never stood a real chance against him. He could place a pitch within inches of his intended target at speeds that gave hitters almost no time to react. And against nearly everyone, that was enough. Against Griffey, it was not enough. Pedro described the problem in one devastating phrase. He felt like he was throwing in slow motion. Now understand what that means coming from a man throwing in the upper 90s. A man whose changeup dropped off the table at speeds that embarrassed hitters who were ready for it. For Pedro to feel like he was throwing slowly, Griffey had to be doing something extraordinary with time, and he was. Griffey's hands were so fast, and his pitch recognition so elite, that he could wait longer than any other hitter to decide whether to swing. While the average professional hitter needed to begin committing to a swing at a certain point in the ball's flight, Griffey could wait several milliseconds more. That fraction of extra time completely changed what he could see and what he could respond to. It meant he could identify a pitch more clearly. It meant breaking balls that fooled other hitters had more time to reveal themselves to Griffey before he committed. It meant Pedro's timing advantage. The gap between the pitch leaving his hand and the hitter needing to decide essentially shrank to almost nothing. And then there was the plate coverage. Pedro observed that Griffey was one of the very few hitters capable of covering the entire plate without ever looking stressed or overextended. Think about what that takes away from a pitcher. Every pitch location became dangerous. The inner third that should jam a hitter. The outer edge that should produce a weak rollover. The low breaking ball that should get a swing at a bad pitch. Griffey covered all of it, without panic, without adjustment, without any sign that you would put him in a difficult position. Pedro described the fear as the fear of the perfect miss. The pitch that was nearly perfect but still lived inside Griffey's expanded zone of destruction. Miss your intended location by an inch. Just 1 inch, and Griffey did not settle for a single. He ended the inning. He hit a high-velocity drive into the gap or over the fence. 1 inch of imprecision against the best pitcher in baseball, and the inning was over. That margin is not a margin at all. That is a trap with no escape route. Pedro was not a young pitcher who did not know how to compete. He was at his peak. He had everything. And the honest thing he communicated through his description of facing Griffey was that peak performance was sometimes simply not enough. That is not a weakness in Pedro's story. That is the highest possible compliment to Griffey's. Because when the best pitcher in the world, executing his best stuff with his best command, still describes his opponent as someone who made him feel like he was throwing slowly, you are not talking about a normal hitter. You are talking about a hitter who existed outside of normal, who played at a level that even the greatest arms in history had to fear. Number 2, Randy Johnson. Now we arrive at something truly fascinating, because Randy Johnson was himself one of the most feared players in all of baseball during the 1990s. The big unit was 6 feet 10 inches tall. He threw 100 miles per hour. He had a scowl that made hitters physically uncomfortable in the box. He was the kind of pitcher who made grown men rethink their career choices. And Randy Johnson looked at Ken Griffey Jr. and identified something he called the intimidation paradox. Here is what Johnson meant. All of the elite players of the 1990s who carried true intimidation showed it on their face. You could see it in the way they walked to the mound. You could feel it in the way they stared. Johnson himself was the gold standard of visible, aggressive, physically present intimidation. But Griffey flipped that completely. Griffey played like he was at recess. That phrase is the key to everything Johnson observed. Because at recess, you are relaxed. You are happy. You are playing, not working. You are not straining or grinding or suffering. You are enjoying yourself. And that is exactly the image Griffey projected. He smiled. He laughed. He made it look easy. He made it look fun. And because the game of baseball is so built on visible effort and visible struggle, that image of effortlessness was deeply disorienting for opponents. A pitcher who sees a hitter looking relaxed and joyful tends to feel a certain way. They might feel like the hitter is not taking the situation seriously. They might feel like they have the upper hand. They might feel the edge that comes from being the one who is working while the other person is just playing. And then Griffey swung, and all of that false security was shattered in a fraction of a second by a singular, violent, perfectly timed swing that sent the ball 450 feet the other way, off an elite slider, in a key moment, with a smile still on his face after it. Johnson understood that the joy was not carelessness. It was a mask. Underneath the recess attitude was a killer instinct that was as sharp as any in the sport. The ability to maintain complete competitive focus without the external markers of intensity. And that is the paradox. The joy made you feel safe. The swing reminded you that you were not. Johnson said that Griffey was a constant threat who could never be ignored, not because he looked menacing, but because the menace was always there, hidden beneath the smile, ready to reveal itself the moment you forgot to respect it. And in a sport where a single swing can change a game, that hidden menace was the most dangerous kind. Number 1, Mariano Rivera. We have saved the most telling testimony for last, because Mariano Rivera is not just any pitcher. He is the greatest closer in the history of baseball by almost every measurement that matters. His career save total, his postseason record, his earned run average, his consistency over 15 seasons at the highest level of the sport. And the weapon he built all of it with was one pitch, the cutter. A pitch that moved so late and so sharply toward left-handed hitters that it routinely shattered their bats and rendered their swings useless. A pitch that almost everyone in the sport eventually conceded was unhittable when executed correctly. Almost everyone. Rivera said this directly. He viewed Ken Griffey Jr. as the final boss of the 1990s. The final boss. Think about what that means in the context of gaming, which is exactly where that phrase comes from. The final boss is the hardest challenge, the one that tests everything you have built, the one where all your skills and all your experience all come down to one confrontation. And Rivera was saying that Griffey was that for him. The one opponent where even perfection was not guaranteed to be enough. The reason came down to one mechanical skill that Griffey had that almost no left-handed hitter possessed at the same level. He could stay inside the ball. In baseball terms, Staying inside the ball means keeping your hands close to your body and driving through the ball with the barrel of the bat in a specific way that allows you to send the pitch the other way, to the opposite field, rather than pulling it toward the pitcher. It is a skill that neutralizes the cutter. Because the cutter's power over left-handed hitters comes from jamming their hands, from getting so close to their body that they cannot extend and drive the ball with any authority. But if the hitter can stay inside and take the pitch the other way, the cutter loses its primary weapon. Griffey could do that. Rivera knew it, and knowing it meant that even when Rivera was executing his best pitch, the pitch that had ended the at-bats of hundreds of elite hitters, he had to acknowledge that the man at the plate had a real counter, a real answer, a real chance to drive that cutter into the gap or over the fence the other way. Rivera said that Griffey was the one guy he could never truly relax against. Even when you were throwing your best, even when the count was in your favor, even in the ninth inning of a high-stakes game with the pressure at its absolute peak, Griffey stayed technically sound. He stayed mechanically intact. He never let the moment reduce his abilities. And Rivera said the standard was simple. Against Junior, he had to be perfect. Not good, not excellent. Perfect. That is the testimony of the greatest closer in history about the standard required to face one hitter. And it is the single most clarifying thing anyone said about what it meant to face Ken Griffey Jr. in his prime. Now let us bring this all together, because when you line up all 9 testimonies, something becomes clear. This was not 9 opinions about the same player. This was 9 different angles of attack on the same impossible fortress. Chipper Jones saw the fortress from the outfield. From the place where your team goes to celebrate a hit and finds instead a man in a 40-foot sprint who takes the celebration away. Mike Piazza heard the fortress from behind the plate. The sound that told you, before the ball even landed, that the game had just shifted in a direction you did not want. Barry Bonds studied the blueprint of the fortress and found no weakness in it, no crack, no consistent spot where a pitcher could park a strategy and trust it. Derek Jeter showed us that the fortress had a style and a presence that extended beyond the chalk lines. That the cultural weight of Junior was itself a tool that altered how opponents thought, how they prepared, how they competed. Frank Thomas showed us that the fortress operated on both sides of the ball. That you could not hide in the defensive half of the game and wait for your turn, because your turn at the plate might have already been erased by a horizontal dive in deep center. Greg Maddux showed us that the fortress resisted the most intelligent attack the sport had ever produced. That a chess master with 4 Cy Young Awards and a lifetime of craft could still find himself in a chess match he could not win. Pedro Martinez showed us that even a surgeon's precision, even near-perfect placement at elite velocity, could still be turned into an opportunity by a man whose hands moved faster than the perception of slow motion. Randy Johnson showed us that the fortress wore a smile. That the most dangerous thing about Junior was not the power or the mechanics, but the joy that disguised the killer instinct underneath. And Mariano Rivera showed us that even the final weapon, the pitch that had conquered nearly every left-handed hitter in the sport, ran into its most difficult test when it faced a man who could stay inside the ball and drive it the other way. 9 testimonies, 9 angles, 1 conclusion. Ken Griffey Jr. was the most complete, most demoralizing, most psychologically overwhelming player of his entire generation. And here is where we have to step back from the fear and the demoralization and sit with what that level of greatness actually meant for the sport. Because yes, Griffey was frightening to face. Yes, he deflated dugouts and warped the psychology of the best pitchers who ever lived. Yes, he made the game feel rigged and hopeless and unfair in the most extraordinary ways. But that is also what greatness looks like from the inside of it. The people who had to compete against it experienced it as a threat, as a pressure, as something that took something away from them. And they were right, it did. But from the outside, from the stands, from the generations of fans who grew up watching him, Ken Griffey Jr. was something else entirely. He was the reason a whole era fell in love with baseball. The backwards cap that became an icon. The swing that became the standard by which all other swings were judged. The catches that became highlight reels before highlight reels were everywhere. The smile that made the whole thing feel like a gift. Griffey was the face of baseball at a moment when baseball desperately needed a face. He was a 90s kid's idol. He was the final boss in video games. He was the subject of documentaries and conversations and arguments and memories that stretched for decades. His mind was as much a part of his greatness as his body. He saw himself succeeding before the game started. He believed that a champion wins in his mind first, then plays the game. He walked into every at-bat with a confidence that was not arrogance, but preparation. He had already seen himself succeed so many times in his mind that the actual success felt like a memory rather than an achievement. And that mindset, combined with a swing that was smooth as butter and full of a rotation that maximized power while looking effortless, and the glove that covered more ground than any rival in center field, made him something that the sport had not produced before and has worked very hard to find again ever since. The monsters that baseball has always feared are the ones who make the game feel small, who walk up to a sport with 100 years of history and tradition and say, quietly and with a smile, that they are simply going to do what they do, and the sport is going to have to figure out how to respond. Ken Griffey Jr. was that kind of monster. MLB's monster. And the sport and the generation that watched him is better for having faced that impossibility. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, this story deserved a like and a subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell us which legend's testimony hit you the hardest. Was it Rivera calling him the final boss? Or Maddox admitting the perfect pitch still got hit? We want to hear from you, and we will see you in the next one.